Hey folks, I wanted to give you a heads up before you start listening that this is a very long episode, like an hour and 45-minute long episode. I thought about breaking it in two, but that just seemed a little ridiculous. So I just left it as one big piece, and I hope that you really enjoy it. Welcome to the Hermit's Lamp podcast. I want to give a big shout out to the fine people who are supporting the Patreon. Not only are they making this happen, which certainly I feel very supported by that process, but also they've started getting all sorts of great new things. I've been recording extra Patreon exclusives with the guests who've been on. We've had Jen Zart on talking about some astrological aspects. We've had Al Cummins talking about geomancy and pizza magic. And we've had the Stacking Skulls crew on talking about their musical influences, both spiritually and ridiculously in their lives. And all of this stuff is only for people who are supporting the Patreon. So please consider it. Think about how many hours of this podcast you've listened to, and jump over to patreon.com/thehermitslamp. If you pledge $5 an episode, you will get access to all of that good stuff, but there are perks at many levels as well. Thanks for supporting it. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, everybody. You're hearing a different voice as the host of this week's Hermit's Lamp podcast. I'm Suzie Chang, friend of Andrew. And Andrew has kindly invited me to come on the show in order to interview him about his new deck, the Orisha Tarot, since he obviously could not interview himself. Normally, at the beginning of an interview, what I would do is introduce the guest, but since the guest is the host, I guess I'll just do a very cursory introduction of what I know about my friend Andrew. As you know, he is the proprietor of the Hermit's Lamp, the store, which is a touchstone for all of us in the tarot community. And he is the voice behind the Hermit's Lamp podcast. He is an artist in his own right and a creator of beautiful works, decks, and he is also a priest in the Lucumí tradition, and we'll be talking about that some more. But the reason that we're here today is to talk about the Orisha Tarot, which is coming out from Llewellyn in September. What day is it?
Basically today, according to Amazon.
For real, fantastic! Yeah, this is very exciting. So I understand decks are already shipping out, and I was also particularly interested in doing this podcast because we're both Llewellyn authors. I've got a book coming out from Llewellyn on tarot correspondences just next month. So shout out to Llewellyn for supporting the work of tarot lovers everywhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the Orisha Tarot is officially out. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's been many years in the making, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's always one of those things. Where do you count that from? You know, I signed my contract for it about 2 years ago, maybe a little bit less than that. So that's probably as good a time as any. But even at that point, I had sort of already made a dozen cards and had spent 5 or 6 years prior to that thinking about it and trying to figure out what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it. So, you know.
Right. And actually, I'd like to back up even further to the beginning of your story in this tradition and to find out a little bit, because it's been about 10 years, I think you've said, something like that.
10 years as a priest, as of August, and it was 2000 when I started getting involved in this tradition. So it's been about 18 years that I've been involved.
Wow. So that's really, it's been a long journey for you. And I was listening to your wonderful interview on our with our friends at the Tarot Visions podcast, and I think you mentioned that you came into it through kind of a circle of friends who were exploring different esoteric traditions, and I kind of wanted to know a little bit more about what drew you. You mentioned that you were, a friend had brought in this his own explorations of Lucumí, and I wanted to first of all sort of talk a tiny bit about the context of Lucumí, since not everyone will be familiar with it, and also a little bit more about your attraction to it. Now, as I understand it, Lucumí is a Cuban offshoot of the greater Yoruba African traditional religion, yeah?
So the story you get will depend a lot on who you talk to, like many things, right? So at the time of the Atlantic slave trade, Yoruban wasn't really cohesive at all. That whole area was a bunch of city-states and so on, right? So this idea that there was sort of one cohesive African traditional religion, or ATR, which these things spreaded from, isn't really historically accurate. If you came from the city of Ife, then your tradition slants in one direction. Certain deities are held above others. If you come from Oyo, then that's going to have a different different set of traditions, and sort of a different kind of more primary veneration, or tilting towards certain deities over others. If you're down sort of in the coastal parts of kind of Western Africa, towards the south end of that sort of prominence, the way in which some of the Orisha are going to manifest, especially the water Orisha, are different than if you're sort of further north or inland or in other places, and so it's important to understand that these sort of, all of these Orisha traditions and their diasporic manifestations, as they found themselves in different countries, throughout the Caribbean and North and South America, they all vary depending on which groups of people were enslaved and brought over, which traditions survived, what happened in relationship to the indigenous culture that was present. In Cuba, the indigenous culture was sort of pretty much wiped out, so there wasn't much inclusion of that into the traditions. Whereas in other parts, especially in South America, some of those cultures continued to sort of live alongside, and there was sort of more sharing of ideas.
Yeah, it seems like in many of the sort of diasporic manifestations, you see faiths that have been heavily syncretized with whatever was going on locally.
Yeah, and I think that the question of synchronization is always an interesting one.
Yeah.
I mean, the story that some people like to say is that they were syncretized in order to conceal them and to prevent,
right,
to protect them and to allow them to practice covertly, and I'm sure that that's true in some ways, but also there's a lot of in non-Western approaches to magic and to spirituality. There's often a real sense of, hey, what's that guy good for? What's that spirit?
Right.
What's that one going to do for me? There's this sort of very practical notion of, you come across somebody and you're like, hey, I read about this guy, what's that saint good for? And there's the syncretization that happens for sure, but there's also the notion of like having more spiritual people in your corner is not a bad idea at all, right?
Exactly.
And so I think that that history is it's interesting to try and unravel, but I think that we'll never really fully understand exactly what was going on with everybody involved.
Exactly. And I think that, people of faith kind of make faith work however they can, right? It's sort of like you'll always have schools of thought that try to keep, try to distinguish and separate and sort of go towards a more purist mentality in terms of practicing faith. And then there are others who will say, well, we work with what we've got,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so to answer kind of like about my lineage, as far back as we know it, originates with this woman Monserrate. She's the farthest back that we can trace that. And my lineage originates in Cuba, and through those sort of Cuban traditions, or Cuban variations of the diasporic traditions, for sure.
Right. So we're specifically talking about a tradition that came to Cuba through the slave trade.
Exactly.
Correct. Yeah. And you actually have some reference to that in, I think, your Ten of Swords card, which seems really appropriate. Yeah.
Sure.
So yeah, I wanted to know a little bit more about your personal journey in terms of whether you yourself grew up in any kind of faith community, or whether you were, did you have to rebel against one? Did you long to belong to a faith community? What was that like for you, and what was discovering this community like for you?
So I think that one of the best things that my parents did was not raise me with any traditions at all. My parents weren't particularly religious, and
so what did you rebel against?
I didn't rebel against it. I mean, I rebelled against everything, but we'll get to that. But so what that meant was, when I said to my mom I wanted to like go to the psychic fair and find some books on magic when I was 12, my mom was like, okay. When I was like picked out Aleister Crowley, she was like, sure, go ahead.
Yeah.
So that meant that I like had a lot of space to really get involved in and think about other things, And, other than sort of, when my parents split up and we started going to Anglican church, mostly I think because my mom wanted some community. I didn't really have a lot of connection or experience with any kind of organized religion. But what happened was when I was 14, I almost died in a car accident.
Right.
And after that, I wanted to understand everything. And so I didn't rebel against anything as such, but what I really wanted to know was like, what does this all mean? Right? Like all of it, at that point, I'd already been reading tarot for a year. I'd already been studying Crowley for a couple of years. I was already really invested in sort of a magical worldview. And at that point, then I just started reading everything I could get my hands on. Right. So I'm in like grade 9 and 10 and reading Nietzsche and seeking out, people who can talk about these things. And, the youth group at the church was run by an ex-Jesuit. And so I like corner him and be like, hey, tell me about this. Tell me about that. Tell me about this. And for the most part, people would indulge me and have conversations with me about it,
Was there another organized religion that you were drawn to before Lucumí?
No, I mean, Crowley's work,
Yes.
For me, it was basically all about Crowley's work.
And you were in the OTO?
Yeah. When I was in it wasn't until much later though. It wasn't until I was, well into my 20s that I actually even considered, I was like, oh, maybe the OTO exists here in Toronto. Maybe I could find people. Mostly I just practiced independently and pursued and tried to talk to people.
Right.
So, and then basically I left the OTO and the Orm Solace, which is another initiatory group, and moved into practicing Lucumí, So that was my journey.
Yeah. So, and it's been, as you said, like an 18-year journey at this point. And so that's something I wanted to sort of ask you about in terms of doing the artwork, telling the stories, introducing the wider world to this tradition. Often when we are talking about faiths we didn't grow up in, there's this question of whether it's your story to tell, or whether, at what point do you become a representative? And so that's a question I have for you. At what point did you feel that you were invested enough, or, that you had a strong enough sense of belonging to be able to bring this to other people?
Sure. So there's a whole bunch of pieces to that answer.
It's a complex one.
Yeah, we'll start with this. When you become a priest, right? You become initiated into a lineage, right? So and when we talk about ancestors, the word we use most of the time is egu, right? We mean Egun to mean ancestors by blood and ancestors by initiation, right? And so, you know, my Egun are those priests of the Orishas going back to Montserrate and beyond, you know, although lost to history beyond that. And so part of the conversation for me is, this is my lineage. These are my ancestors at this point, right? And, you know, and this is something that we take pretty seriously within the tradition, right? Initiation and lineage are really significant.
Right.
And so that's part of the thing. Part of it is, although my parents did not practice this tradition, I'm initiated into this lineage in a traditional way.
So there's a difference here between blood lineage and spiritual lineage.
But the word does not differentiate, and we don't differentiate, right? So you could get a reading, and your traditional reading, and your reading could come in a good way or a bad way, depending on what's going on with you, from the Egun, right? From the
right.
And when we're divining, if it's possible, we want to mark who that is, and we would ask ancestors from the lineage and ancestors from the bloodline, depending on what the reading came out as. It would guide us, and we could narrow it down and be like, oh yeah, you know, the ancestors are upset with you, and in this case it's someone from your blood family, or in some other case it's somebody from your initiatory lineage. But we don't differentiate. The word means the same, right?
Yes, I seem to remember reading something this past week about the idea that, you know, there's sort of one bloodline sort of over one shoulder and spiritual guidance over the other, but they sort of combine, and you need both. And I guess, you know, speaking about the outlook and cosmology of the faith, would it be fair to say that, you know, you come into this religion, but the religion itself, you know, proceeds from the assumption that everybody, no matter where you come from, no matter who your parents or grandparents, et cetera, were, you know, has a relationship or a potential relationship they haven't yet realized with the Orisha?
I don't think that that's actually true.
Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get to the bottom of here.
So, you know, before we come to Earth, we choose our destiny, right? We choose our Ori, right? Ori is sort of not easily translated into one thing, but if you think of it as sort of your guardian angel, your destiny, and your higher self, all as one entity, that's probably a reasonable set of points to make sense of it for people who have those ideas already. And when you choose your destiny before you come to Earth, it's sealed, right? And so it's we don't know what all it entails before we come, but if it's part of your destiny to get initiated into the Orisha tradition, then opportunities will present themselves for that. It's not to say that you couldn't force them otherwise, but those wouldn't be in alignment with your destiny. And really, you know, when we're talking about sort of initiation and sort of connection and those kinds of things, they really all ought to either be dictated by divination or dictated by Orisha in possession of people, right?
Yes.
It's not really, you know, there are many people who will come. There are people who come and the Orishas are like, yeah, we'll help you, right? Or the people will come and be like, no, you should go do something else, right? Here's the direction. Go over that way. Go look at those people, you know. Or go look at these other traditions. It's definitely not meant for everybody per se, and it's not closed in, you know, in any particular way. Although certain houses and certain, you know, lineages might be more closed to outsiders than others, based on a whole bunch of different factors. But it's much more so that you know, if it's part of your destiny, the opportunity will arise. If it's not, then you might run into it, but they might say, no, you're good. Go to that other thing.
Right, right. Well, this is interesting to me because I've noticed that there seem to be a lot of people who are clearly didn't grow up within the culture who have become drawn to this religion or some form of it, some form of the faith, and, taking it on. And it seems as though there is, a certain openness to those who commit themselves, whether or not they grew up or had family or, understood the culture, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are opportunities definitely for people to engage and connect with these traditions, and there are definitely practitioners around who are, open, to people who didn't grow up in these traditions and so on, for sure, right? I mean, that's definitely a thing, and I think that one of the things that I see going on is that certain people seem like they're looking for tradition, right? They've been kind of doing something that doesn't have a long living history, and they're kind of looking backwards or looking around for those things that do. I think that's part of why the Tarot de Marseille is sort of resurfacing.
Right.
I think that it's why, the Orisha traditions are shifting and coming forward more,
Right. That's one of the things that, I guess that's why I was asking you so much about your own backgrounds in terms of, working independently versus belonging, right? Because I think that that's something that a lot of us struggle with, especially those of us who grew up, in an era where religious community isn't something that one takes for granted. Yeah. So anyway, I think we should probably turn a little bit to the work itself.
Well, let me finish answering because we started with this question of me and sort of doing this deck, right? Sort of like, and we kind of started talking about the ancestral piece, and we drifted away, and there are a couple other things that I want to sort of touch base, right?
Good. Yeah.
So I mean, one of the things, like I did a bunch of things around creating and starting this process and getting sort of permission before starting this process, and certainly one of them was sitting with my elders and talking about what I wanted to do, and getting advice from them, and certainly part of it was asking the Orishas themselves, asking Allegra for his blessing to proceed with this project, and also sort of sitting down with people and sort of showing my art with different people and people of color and so on, to kind of consult around my choices around representations and so on. So
absolutely. I
really wanted to you can never please anybody, and I'm sure there are people who will be upset by the deck, and well, that's life, right?
But it sounds as though you have a lot of support, at least within the community you have access to, for the work that you undertake.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about like approaching making a tarot deck coming out of the various traditions you come out of. So I know that you started out with Crowley and the Thoth deck, I know you pronounce it Thoth, and also that your primary commitment as a reader for quite a while has been the Marseille deck. So why did it seem like a natural choice to you to translate or to represent what you know from Orisha as a tarot deck? I think a lot of people would say, well, since there isn't an obvious 78 card structure, number of deities, all the sort of correspondences that tend to underlie at least the Golden Dawn derived decks, or the general tradition of tarot reaching back to the 15th century. Why do a tarot deck and not something more freeform like an oracle deck?
Well, because one of the reasons why I made this deck was that I wanted to create a bridge between the people who have traditional experience with the Orishas and people who have experience with the traditional tarot structure.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to use those two pieces as a way of creating a bridge so that people could sort of have more understanding of each other and of what's going on, right? And,
yeah.
And so I really, I mean, I've got nothing against Oracle decks. I mean, I released one earlier in the year,
Mm-hmm.
but in trying to think about something as large and expansive as the Orisha traditions, it really having a clear structure like the tarot structure allowed me to frame and set the conversation in a way that that allowed me to finish it, because otherwise right?
Right. It's otherwise, how do you know when it's done?
Yeah, right. I mean, we divine with upwards of 256 different signs.
Right.
Each of those signs is as complicated or as a trump card or as sophisticated as a trump card.
Right.
And then there's depending on who you ask, I mean, a bunch of primary Orishas and maybe even like hundreds if you start getting into different paths and roads, and it just expands infinitely in every direction, right? So
I'm curious whether there's much crossover between the two communities that you've noticed. I mean, tarot and Orisha.
Sure, lots of people. I mean, I know lots of people who are initiated. I mean, that sort of syncretic piece, that like, hey, what can I do with this? That continues to be a prominent part of a lot of Orisha practitioners' lives, right?
Yeah.
It's more purely, like just the Lucumí Orisha stuff. Many people practice some combination of, Palo Mayombe and Spiritismo and card reading and, other things, depending on who they are and what they feel is important and what they have access to. So there's not a lot of like sort of hard rules.
Yeah.
About the Orisha tradition. It's certainly not the tradition I practice.
Right.
I mean, definitely don't mix them in one ceremony.
But it's okay if you practice them separately.
If you go to church on Sunday and and then you tend your ancestral Boveda and then you have some Orisha and you go between them, and depending on what you feel and need, it depends on where you go. It's a really common experience for a lot of people. So
yeah, I'm glad you addressed that, because that's something I was really curious about. You don't dilute your practice by sort of mixing a bit of everything. On the other hand, you're one person, and if you're drawn to different practices, then perhaps you're drawn to different practices for different needs.
Sure. And if the Orishas don't want you doing that, they'll tell you.
Right.
They'll be like, stop it. Don't do that.
That's not cool. Yeah. So a little bit about sort of what people can expect when they're approaching the cards. Now, it's not like there's particular Orisha per card. There's Orisha in some representations in some cards. Some cards have concepts from Lucumí. Some cards have one of the Odu on them. So sort of like, how did you approach how you wanted to impart all of this information structurally into the deck?
So I wanted to try and avoid what I had seen done in other decks in the past. Not because it's wrong per se, but because I feel like it doesn't give the conversation enough meat, right? So, a lot of decks would say, well, Shango is the king, and therefore he's the emperor, and so when I draw the emperor, I'm going to draw Shango, right? And that's fair. I mean, Shango is the emperor, right? He's the king of the Orishas. But there's a lot more to it than that, right? What does that mean? And in what way does kingship or power in that way show up in a variety of different contexts? And what are the different conversations that we could have, right?
Exactly.
And so when I was sort of working with the trump cards, I wanted to sort of embody the ideas that I see being behind, behind the cards themselves: spiritual authority, earthly authority, fortune and chance, like different things. I wanted to sort of embody those bigger ideas and try and avoid kind of just a straight this symbol equals this symbol here.
Yeah, I call that the matchy match.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
When I was looking at the number cards, which for me often represent sort of more the what and the how of life, right? I wanted to kind of focus more on stories, and sort of those things that tend to be more about particular patakis or stories or ideas from the lives of the Orishas and the lives of their practitioners, and where that kind of overlaps and integrates with those numbered cards. And then when I got to the court cards, I wanted to really kind of explore the way in which the court cards can be sort of seen to line up with roles people might play in the community, right?
Right.
So when we're looking at those, we see, one of them, the Aleo, the new person who's just coming to this tradition and who's beginning to learn, and they're making an offering to, the butcher, who is a very skilled and important part of the ceremonies and the community, to the elders who run the ceremonies, and the singers and the drummers and the artists and all of those things. So I kind of went through and sifted those ideas into where I felt they aligned with the court cards best. So the court cards then become really positions or roles one might find oneself in the religion. And, over time, just like, with the traditional idea of the court cards, over time we might move between them. Or it might be, we might play this role in this community and that role in another community, and so on. So.
Right. And I think that underscores what I think sometimes we forget about court cards, which is that we can be any of them, and we are any and all of them at different times. Yeah. So about that, a word you brought up just before, which I think is pretty important for us to discuss, the word pataki, the story. So can you tell us a little bit about how that how that is contextualized within the faith? And also, we should mention that is the name of the book that goes with the deck, Patakis of the Orisha Tarot. Yeah.
So patakis are the stories of the Orishas and their practitioners that are meant to be instructive, right? The word parable, as a way to maybe give a different word for it in English, and especially when we're divining, right? We'll often give a proverb, and we'll often tell a story about the Orishas, and this is part of this oral tradition of it, that we are expressing these ideas in ways that allows us to tell the person things in ways that are easier to hold on to, easier to integrate. They give us some meat, rather than just saying, hey, don't do this thing. We might also tell the story of when one of the Orishas did that thing and what happened to them.
Yes.
Oh yeah, okay, I see that. I shouldn't do that thing because this is going to happen. Right? There'll be a problem.
There's something about these stories that's so human and relatable, right? I mean, is it not the case that the Orisha themselves were at one time human, or before they became more than human?
Well, it's a contested, somewhat contested point of view. Many Orisha are what's known as Urumale. They came from heaven, right? They originated purely from spirit. There are Orishas who are considered deified ancestors, Shango being one of them. Odudua being another one. There are these spirits, these people who led great lives and led their communities and so on, and became, deified after their death. The question that comes up in those conversations then also is, were those lives that Orisha, descending and living on Earth for a period of time?
Yes,
so,
right.
I mean, I think that there's no clear answers to that, but in general, the majority of the Orishas did not start as human, but originated as part of the unfolding of creation, and then came to sort of live these lives and have these stories and experiences we now understand. And also, you know, when we're talking about some of these stories, I think that we also need to understand that some of them, and there's no real easy historical way to say which ones are not, but a good chunk of them were probably stories about priests of those spirits.
I see.
Made these mistakes in their lives, or you know, it's like, oh yeah, you remember Bill, the priest of Obatala who lived down the road? Remember when he did this? Yeah, I remember that, right?
Right.
Then those stories become, you know, part of the myth, right? Part of the lexicon of these traditions. So.
Yes, I guess what makes me wonder, you know, what their relationship with mortality and humanity is because these stories, the emotions and the sort of currents that they represent are things that anyone can relate to. You know, there's jealousy, there's anger, there's, you know, there's infidelity, there's theft, there's, you know, there's things that you don't, sort of in the same way that in the Greek mythology, you see people, you see deities acting badly, right? Or in ways that show that they can make mistakes too.
Yeah, definitely. One of my elders likes to say, you know, they made those mistakes, you don't need to, okay? Right? But you know, we're all human, right? We're gonna learn, or we're not gonna learn, but we'll learn one way or another,
right? So a little bit more about deck structure. So first of all, I noticed immediately that there were some sort of ways in which your experience with tarot informed the deck. First of all, there's definitely a little bit of a Thoth sensibility in that, for example, your strength and justice are ordered in the way that the Thoth deck and the Marseille deck do, rather than the Rider-Waite-Smith. I noticed that you have ordered it wands, cups, swords, discs, fire, water, air, earth, which is a very hermetic thing. And the very fact that you call them discs is also, you know, comes out of the Thoth tradition. But I also wanted to know a little bit, for example, of, I can sort of understand where the structure for the majors comes from, but what I wanted to know a little bit more is about the pips, because, you know, your primary reading background comes from, as far as the, you know, assigning meaning to the pips, I guess would be based in Thoth originally. I wondered if there was sort of more relationship, you know, would someone who comes from a Rider-Waite-Smith tradition instantly recognize, or from a Golden Dawn tradition, instantly recognize the concepts in each of these minor cards?
Well, I mean, I think so.
Maybe. Yeah. I can tell you that I certainly did.
Yeah, I mean, here's my hope about this deck, you know. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, obviously, I started with the Thoth deck, and I read with that deck for many years exclusively. Mm-hmm. But I also read a ton of books on tarot, right? Mm-hmm. During that time, and had a lot of conversations, especially once I started branching out into the communities more. And, you know, I mean, I've read lots of books on the Waite-Smith tradition, and, you know, I mean, you know, all that sort of, and a bunch of that older stuff, you know, mm-hmm. Hermetic or otherwise. So when I was creating this deck, there are, you know, people who are reading the book, you'll come to some spots and you'll hit a few cards where it's like, you know, in the Marseille tradition, people often think of this card this way. And I'll give a little bit of context, and then when you go and read it, it'll make a ton of sense.
Yeah.
And that's really mostly because I could have written 10 times as much about these cards as I did. But Llewellyn said, you can only make a book so big.
Right.
And I really endeavored to sort of kind of hold what I see as kind of the middle of the road on these meetings, right? You know, the numbering is the numbering. And to me, ultimately, the numbering, this might be blasphemy from a Hermetic point of view, but to me, the numbering of the trump cards is really largely irrelevant.
I think it's arbitrary. Yeah.
It's a historical precedent that so what, you know?
Although Andrew, I mean, I think it's important that you made Allegra the fool. I think, you know,
for sure.
Yeah, as the Orisha who comes first, right?
For sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But you know, like choosing justice to be this number or that number, I'm like,
right.
I almost never even look at the numbers when I read cards because I just look at cards, right?
Right.
So, this deck is really meant to be, a kind of relatively even representation of tarot as it exists today, right? So
yeah.
it's none of it's slanted too much one way or another. There's no like, well, you need to know that Crowley called this card the Eon. You need to know that the goddess Nuit means this. It's
right.
not like that at all, right?
Yeah, I mean, my sensation as I was getting to know the deck was really that, it was about the stories and which story fit which card best.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I actually really, I wouldn't have guessed that I would have felt this was so important, but the feedback that I've gotten from the people who've gotten their books already or gotten their copies already, or who I shared advanced copies with and stuff, is including some non-tarot people who just are reading it because they really like me. Is that the feedback I keep getting is that the material is really accessible, and to me that's like a really important thing. I didn't want to make this difficult. I avoided using as much jargon or like Lukumi words or other things as possible. I really I didn't get into Hermetic philosophy particularly anywhere. Like there are all these branches and wings of my own personal experiences and practice that I just brought them all down to the dining hall and was like, all right, let's all have lunch together and talk about stuff in a general way. It's hard to make that happen. So
right. Well, I think that I think it's really important for anyone coming to this deck to get to know the book, to read the book, really read the book, because it's 350 pages. It's real. It's got every single page not only has the story that's associated with the card, but also sort of breaks down the symbols that you included in the card, what its divinatory meaning might be, and sort of what the advice might be that goes with it. And I found that incredibly helpful in terms of like, if I came across a card where my own sort of tarot background wasn't making it immediately obvious to me what you were trying to do, I could just go to the book and it was really clear, within a minute. So I think that this is one of those things where, and I generally am not a person who believes that readers always have to go to the book, but I think it is really enriching and helpful to contextualize using what you wrote for this deck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think unless somebody has a strong living practice with the traditional Orisha practice, it might be hard to start just by looking at it. Obviously, if come from those traditions and read cards as well, then maybe they don't read the book as much.
Mm-hmm.
It's always interesting as I share the images on on social media and stuff. I get priests jumping on the thing and be like, oh, you chose to represent this here, it's perfect.
Right.
Like, they just get it, right? Because they have both of those pieces. But it's so nice to see people be moved to see themselves and to see this tradition in this way, which is really gratifying. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Before we move off structure and start talking a little bit more about the art and some specific cards, is there a sort of through line in each suit that we should be looking for? Something that's going on in wands only, something that's going on in cups or swords or discs?
That was a notion that I abandoned along the way.
Mm-hmm.
In making a deck, there always comes this point where the reality check steps in, and you're like, this is the limit of what I can do, And, and the idea that there was sort of one through line for each set of suits, I couldn't really find it. And, there are a couple other ideas about levels of detail and symbolic representation that I just realized I'd be spending another 5 years like hand drawing beaded things on it. I'm like, that can't happen.
Right. And there are certainly color and number correspondences you could have worked with, but by forcing it into, the existing tarot structure or into Hermetic structure, I think you would have been doing something that was not necessarily conducive to the most rich environment of reading these cards.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, although I'm looking at sort of, I've separated my deck out, sorted it out, Ace Cups, I'm just looking at the aces, and there's, sorry, Wands, Cups, Swords, Discs. I'm looking at the aces, and there's definitely, I get, at least just from my background, I get an elemental feeling off of those cards, you know, a fire, water, air, earth feeling. And even if that's not something that you intended to do or carried throughout the deck, it's still, there's still something there, I think.
For sure. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, in making this deck, it's definitely a lot of stuff just sort of emerged, right? From in the creative process. And although I spent a lot of time thinking and writing and making notes about what went where and why and so on, when I sat down to make the cards, a lot of stuff just emerged as part of that process, you know, from the muse, from the creativity, by chance or whatever. My unconscious formulated it. So there's a lot of stuff in there that happened as I was making the cards. It wasn't necessarily fully thought out.
But which is just part of you as a reader and a practitioner.
Yeah, I mean, you spend 32 years working with the tarot, right? Like, there's a lot of ideas in the back of the brain there that are trying to come out in one way or another. You know? Right.
So let's talk a little bit about the way the cards look for those people who haven't been lucky enough to pick up their decks yet. It's a gorgeous production. First of all, I think you know the artwork's just stunning, and Llewellyn did a great job, I think, as well. First of all, it's a borderless deck, which thank you. You know, that's just, yeah.
Llewellyn let me do something that they had never done before, which was all the titles are handwritten.
Yeah, yeah.
Written into the cards, right? So
right.
They're not obscured. They're easy enough to see when you're looking, but there's
you can
no
find them. Yeah,
top or the bottom. So they fit in more with the artwork. So it's easier to kind of just look at the artwork, or just look for the title when you need to.
Right.
That was something that we had a bunch of conversations with. And in the end,
I think it was a brilliant choice because, you know, it really foregrounds the story of the art. The art fills the frame. You know, everything about it allows you to immerse yourself in what's going on in that picture. And then secondarily, you know, check out whatever title it was so that you can sort of match it up with your own tarot knowledge. But I really appreciated that, and I'm really glad that they made that decision and you know, suggested it. And also, it's the colors are so saturated and so bold. So the texture and look that you were going for was based on gouache, right?
Well, so actually I mean, I used to paint in gouache a lot before I had kids. But, you know, having kids and having a space to set up art in a, you know, small urban space isn't really that easy, right?
Right.
So certainly, I mean, that's a piece of my sensibility and my aesthetic. But the part of what I was really looking for is, you know, starting, it's hard to date now, but starting quite a while ago, I went from being like super structured and really trying to sort of make everything perfect to really kind of moving to a more gestural and looser way of working. And so, you know, this kind of comes out of that, you know, sort of move away from, you know, sort of pursuing absolute realism to, you know, pursuing something else. And then the other piece of the aesthetic is, you know, I wanted to include different pieces of symbolism, but I didn't want to like make it look like the Toth deck where there's so many symbols that you don't really know what to look at.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I decided along the way was, you know, there's a lot of use of textiles, especially in Africa and West Africa. And in the Orisha traditions, there's a lot of use of textiles in making thrones and making ceremonial outfits, you know, in making panuelos, which are like these elaborate cloths that we put on top of the Orishas sometimes. And so I wanted to kind of have a reference to that without trying to like emulate or recreate specific patterns, but use that that visual idea to create more of a space for that symbolic language to hold, right? Through the use
Yes.
through the use of number and through whatever other symbols got added to those designs and so on. So
Yeah, I really picked up on the fact that the design sensibility behind this had that sort of sense of, you know, scope and flow and bold lines that you get in textile. And, you know, that's not something you always see in tarot. So it was really kind of a relief to the eye to sort of not get too, I don't know, bound up in the busy.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that what we see is, you know, a sort of a looseness of the line but at the same time, a real exactness in terms of what symbols you wanted to portray and the way that you foregrounded them in each card. So you did this actually on an iPad, right?
I did. Yeah, I did all of this digitally. I've been working pretty much exclusively digitally for the last 5 or 6 years now, I guess. Ever since, yeah.
Yeah, and does that have to do with, you know, being busy, being a parent, being, you know, just trying to live life in addition to being an artist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a studio space.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't have, you know, Toronto is apparently one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in. Thanks for that, whoever's responsible for that. But space is certainly at a premium. And, you know, the only space where I maybe could do more studio type work is at the shop. And I just spend lots of time at the shop seeing clients and doing other stuff. I don't really want to be at work, even if it's sort of as a creative outlet.
Right.
And, you know, the iPads, it's always with me. And, you know, when I was making this deck, I would just be like, oh, I've got an hour, time to work on one of the cards a bit, you know?
Yeah.
Do some writing or, you know, whatever. It's just, it's always at hand. It's super portable. And especially, I got an iPad Pro, like one of the big ones, and the Apple Pencil, which sort of finally I was able to make happen through this process. And, you know, it's the best thing ever. Like, it's just.
Yeah, and if you get interrupted, you know, you can just save it and then pick it up later. Yeah.
You know, and I'm sure, like, kind of from a production point of view too, you know, I mean, you can work in layers, like in Photoshop. Which is a real treat. So all the backgrounds are their own layers, and all the symbols are.
Oh, that's great.
You know, like the line work symbols and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So if I make a mistake or if I want to change something, I change my mind later.
Right. Right. Plus, it gives you more freedom. I mean, it's like if you're doing a background, you don't want to just like stop to make room for the foreground, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, you know, I mean, I just sent all the Photoshops to Llewellyn, and you know, they asked me if they could take some of them apart and use pieces for making the box and other stuff, which they did, which is fantastic. I'm so delighted with it. You know, it allows for a variety of options in a way that you know, traditional mediums just don't. You know.
Yeah, I was really excited to realize that you did this in a digital format like that, just because I didn't know that you could create art like this in that way and have it come out looking so good, you know? And the other thing is that I thought it was really funny that, just practically speaking, that it made so much sense for you. This is one of my sort of hobby horses, the idea of just how difficult it is to be both a parent and a practitioner, you know? I mean, just to live your life and try to do this work is a constant struggle. Like, you know, you're in the middle of a banishing ritual and some kid is like coming through saying, Mom, I missed the bus. You know, it's like, it's every day, you know, trying to make that work is, I think, tricky for a lot of us. So I'm glad you found a way to make this happen.
Me too.
Okay, so I'd love to, if you feel like it, I'd love to talk a little bit about specific cards. If you could just give me a second, I have to plug, my laptop's going to run out of charge. I'd have to plug it in real quick.
Yeah.
Just be right there. Okay, we're good.
All
All
right.
right. And I can strip that out of the tape if you want later on. Okay. So let's talk about a couple majors. I wanted to return to the Fool card because I think that's super important, where you have Allegra, who is, I guess, I don't want to make the mistake of trying to do too much equivalency here, but he is the one who makes communication possible, as I understand it.
Yeah. Allegra is the Orisha we speak to first in every ceremony, because he opens and closes the ways. And Allegra is all of the communication everywhere, on every single level, right? If we think about it, sort of, is the communication between the cells in your bodies, is the communication between the parts of the universe. Nothing exists or could happen without Allegra being there to facilitate that transfer of information from one place to another.
Right. And so I think, that's what makes it so important and so appropriate that he's the first card in the deck. You have to, even to open your mouth to gather the air to speak, you have to have it there, right? Although he also has a presence in a number of other cards as well. And what people will see when they look at it is, I guess, a common representation of Allegra is this sort of stone or concrete head with the cowrie shells embedded in it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when people, a common solution, a relatively common solution to sort of troubles in people's lives is to receive what's referred to as the warriors, which is Allegra, Ogun, and Ochosi. And it's an initiation that you don't need to be a priest to have. It can be, anybody can receive this if it's marked and required. And, they come into your life to help you fight your problems and overcome your obstacles and so on. And what there's actually, people are really accustomed to seeing these sort of cement heads with the cowrie shells. But, traditionally, depending on your lineage, the Alleguas, they would mark the path of Allegra, and there are many different ways in which an Allegra might be made. But I chose to make the one that people understand and see the most because I wanted it to be somewhat familiar to people, for sure.
Right, and this is actually a symbol that ordinary people might have in their homes, right?
Maybe.
Yeah. Well, just real quick, after I got your deck, I had the craziest dream where I dreamed that I got up and I went outside, and this was like around midnight, and the UPS truck comes and gives me a package with my name on it. And I open it, and I suddenly start to feel really strange, like I'm high or I've taken something, ingested some kind of substance, like just through opening the package. And then I was instantly transported into some kind of rite that was going on in my dining room, and Allegra was there. And I thought this was, obviously this is not, I knew almost nothing before this week about this tradition, and I certainly have no way of knowing what significance that had or what I certainly can't speak for the tradition in any way, but I thought it was so interesting that, my dream maker chose to take the delivery of your deck to me, as this kind of mind-altering, frame-shifting event, and then introduce, this personification of communication, the opener of the ways into the dream. So it was, I was very, very grateful for that experience. Okay, so the other major I really wanted to make sure we talked about was the priestess card, because it's not what most people would normally expect to see in a priestess card, and I thought you could talk a little bit about what we're looking at and how it relates to the high priestess we know and love.
So this is actually one of the cards that gave me the biggest trouble. I spent a lot of time working on this card. There are a bunch of drawings that got scrapped along the way because I was just like, nope, that's not going to cut it. That's too simple. That's too this, too whatever, right? And, so what we see, I'll just find the card here. So what we see in the priestess card is we see a bunch of cowrie shells, right?
Right.
And the dilogun, or the cowrie shells, are one of the traditional tools of divination. For alochas, for priests, in the way that I'm a priest, it's the way in which we speak with the Orishas. And when we divine with the shells, we pray and we invoke an opening with Allegra or whoever for an odu, for a sign, for the idea almost like a card to sort of arrive.
Mm-hmm.
But those energies, those odus, are the living unfolding of the universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they represent all of the knowledge that was and is, and all of the possible knowledge of the future, or possible unfoldings of the future. And so those energies that arrive when we do a reading and come to play in the life of the person who gets the reading done, it's actually a serious ceremony to get a reading. It alters the course of your life, right? And when we think about the priestess or the papess, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we can talk about is knowledge, right? And is deep metaphysical knowledge, right?
Right.
Think of
which isn't readily accessible to you at a surface level.
Right.
Yeah.
And when we think about the Hierophant or the Pope as sort of the outer face of spirituality, the High Priestess is the inner face. She's the inner mystery of that, right?
Right.
And she is that knowledge which is hard to get to, that knowledge which is hard won, and that knowledge which is tied to a deep respect and a deep cosmic awareness of the nature of the universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and this odu, or this odu and the method of divination, the process of divination, to me mirrors that, right? And so
Correct.
the shells become the mouth of the priestess, right? And if we look at it in a sort of a rider-waite symbol, right? The cascarilla and the ota, the black stone.
Yes.
They mirror, we use those in the divination process, but they mirror those two columns.
The Boaz and Jachin.
Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The positive and negative vibrations that are in that sort of duality.
And those are a kind of, are they a yes-no kind of stand-in?
Yeah, we use them and other things to ask specific questions within the reading. We each have, there's about a half dozen Igbo that all have ritual significance, and we use them in different ways depending on the nature of the question we're asking.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing that's going on in this card is usually people divine on a straw mat or a tray with cowrie shells. Some people use a wooden tray maybe, but more often than not a straw mat. So I wanted to create this idea of the straw mat, but then this idea that sort of below it is this sort of cosmic opening, right? It's a connection to everything.
Yeah.
So this is actually probably one of the most abstracted cards in the whole deck.
Mm-hmm.
And that it doesn't sort of show an Orisha or a thing that's sort of immediately easily connectable. But I think that it really represents a sort of that depth of knowledge and connection and direct connection to the voice of creation that I associate with the High Priestess, and that I associate with this divination process.
Yes. Now the Odu themselves, they're transmitted orally, right? It's not something that you just pick up a book and not anyone can do it.
Yeah, if you are not a priest, you cannot read cowrie shells, right?
Got you. Mm-hmm.
There's no. The best thing we could say is that you don't have the spiritual license, and and my elders would be quite clear. You can do anything you want with these shells, but they don't speak for the Orishas. Therefore, whatever you get is irrelevant.
Right. So it's not like in what we think of as tarot readers. You just pick up a deck and anyone can give it a go. This is something that you really need to go through initiation and be crowned as a priest to do. And
spend a long time studying, right? You need to understand that. So there are 256, technically 257 signs speak, each of those signs has a specific hierarchical order of Orishas that speak in them. Each of them has proverbs, songs, ceremonies, offerings, taboos, patakis, and then each of those signs can come in ire, like in a sign of blessing, or sobo, a negative sign. And then there are many kinds of ire and osobo, and if you start multiplying those out, you start to realize how many different permutations are possible in this system.
Right.
It's a very long time and a lot of study to really come to understand what all those things mean. And
yeah, and is that something that, so this is something that you might do as a priest, correct?
Yeah.
And did you internalize all of those 256, 257 signs, or is it an ongoing study? How does that work for you?
There's no end to the study.
Right, right.
Like Hermeticism. When do you know enough? You never know enough.
Oh, you never know enough. No. There. Right. Okay. Well, that's really helpful in terms of getting into the card. Are there any other majors that you'd kind of like to draw attention to before we look at minors?
No, I'm happy to take your lead.
Okay, great. And I'm, honestly, I would love to go through every single card in the deck, and I was having a lot of trouble sort of singling out a few that might be interesting to talk about. But given our time constraints, we'll just focus on some. I was looking at the Nine of Wands. We're kind of going in order here. Nine of Wands, and see on this card, it's so interesting because as I understand it from your story, this is a representation of Yemaya, or one of her avatars, I guess.
Yeah.
And there's a shipwreck or a underwater ship, and she's got a knife, and the knife has clearly just been used. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that people, in making the deck, I wanted to disrupt people's preconceived notions, right, of certain things. Like people, it's common for people to say, oh, yeah, if you want love, go and talk to Oshun, right? And Oshun will help you find love. Right? It's possible, right? It depends on which Oshun and what context and so on and so on, right? But, Oshun also doesn't really dig people complaining very much. It's not a thing that she's really that into. And so depending on the attitude in which you're feeling about this, Oshun might also be irritated by you approaching her about it. So it's very hard to say, right?
Yeah.
And so, which is why, traditional practitioners divine, right? Because the real answer is, in traditional divination, any Orisha that offers to help you with a problem can help you with that problem. And whether we would sort of generally associate that with being their purview or not doesn't really matter, because if they say they're going to help, they're going to help, and you just say thank you, right?
Right.
And so when we think about Yemaya, people think about Yemaya as a sort of loving mother energy, as a sort of always supportive energy, right? Her energy really, sometimes people are sent to work with her when they need sort of grounding and stabilizing in their emotions, right?
Yeah.
But, Yemaya also has many roads and has many avatars, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about, Ibu Okoto, it's not gentle. She's really a lot more like a shark, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, the idea, the thing that people often say is that, when the ship wrecks, she grabs the sailors and takes them down to their fate, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this real sort of show of strength and power with her that isn't what we would normally associate with it, but which is 100% a part of her personality, or at least her personality on that path, right?
Right. And I actually thought that this was, the more I thought about it, the more strongly tied it felt to my own understanding of this card. I mean, when I think of the Nine of Wands, I think of someone who has been derived their strength from the vicissitudes of life, from, the experiences of having suffered and having learned.
Yeah.
And I think that it's also, I also think of it as a very lunar card, you know, so that kind of made it feel familiar to me as well. But also the fact that, you know, that power has a impersonality and ruthlessness to it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Nine of Wands, when it shows up to talk about people, it can speak of people who are strong, clear, incredibly competent, and sometimes hard for other people to relate to because of those things, right?
Yeah, they've been through a lot.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, fascinating. So, and plus, it's just beautiful. Just you know, you see the body of Yemaya, but you don't. At first, you may not even recognize that it's a human form because of, you know, blue on blue. It's a very underwater card. Yeah. Okay. Looking at, you know, one of my favorite cards of all is your Ten of Cups, and which I did receive this week once, and what I love about it is the story that goes along with it. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So when we were talking earlier in the podcast about picking your Ori or picking your destiny, right? This card represents that process, right? You know, when everybody's hanging out up in Orun, up on the other side where, you know, where we're all spirits, eventually, you know, people, for whatever reasons, decide it's time to come back to Earth, right? It's time to come down here, you know, to the marketplace, to hang out and party, to fulfill something they haven't fulfilled, whatever it may be. And when they make that decision, they go, you know, as my elders describe it, you go down the hall to this room where Ajala, who is the Orisha who crafts these destinies as a series of sealed gourds.
And that's the picture that we see on the card. We see Ajala with the gourds.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it more as a person choosing their destiny.
Oh, okay, I see. All right.
Themselves, but yeah, but maybe I don't.
Could be right.
Ajala is, at least as far as I know, I have never come across any personifications of them.
So in your mind, this was the soul,
right?
Choosing which one.
You know, and but we don't have a sort of super clear sense of karma or carryover from one life or another. It's not really. It's kind of a mystery that we acknowledge that we don't fully understand, right? So you go to a room full of sealed gourds and you pick something, and you know, it could be horrible, right? It could be great,
right.
Could be whatever. But if you've been good friends with Allegra, you know, and if you've kind of kept good faith with him, yeah, maybe kind of like you reach out for something and he gives a little cough and says, "Hey, not that one, don't take that one." Right?
And I love this, that you have this little sketch of Allegra under the table, you know, very quiet, very subtle. Yeah. Just giving you a hint.
Yeah. And then, so once you pick your destiny, you go back and see the creator, and they breathe life into you and your soul goes into a body.
And you can see in the background of the card, you can see the outline of the earth. So, you know, this is this idea that you're outside of the material realm at that moment, choosing your fate. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's just really beautiful. And I think it's quite relatable to, you know, in a traditional sense, to the Ten of Cups, which I at least think of as very much the end of a cycle. You know, I often think of it as the end of the complete sequence of minors in some ways, because if you go through correspondence, it immediately precedes the Two of Wands. But there's also this feeling, you know, when you see the family on the Rider-Waite-Smith Ten of Cups, of this sort of being they're taking a bow, right? This is this destiny is finished, and we're looking towards the next one.
People, the belief is that people tend to reincarnate along family lines, right?
Right.
It's also returning to that family, right?
Right. You know, so there's definitely a feeling of kindred there. Speaking of which,
go ahead.
I was just going to look at the Eight of Cups as well, because I think that one is a little, may not be as obvious to people when they look at it, what the relationship is to the Eight of Cups we know and love.
Yeah, so in the Eight of Cups, I chose to represent sort of all of the ancestral traditions or pieces that get practiced. You know, in the background, there's a sort of, you know, Boveda practice or spiritism practice, represented by the cups and the big cup with the cross in it. In the front, the practice of feeding the ancestors and sharing with them that is part of the Egun practice, and the stick that we use to when we're praying to the Egun. And then there's this other sort of abstract shape, which is in Ifa. There's this tile that's made that goes where people worship their ancestors to help manage that energy. You know, the Eight of Cups is, it's a card where, can deal with loss and deal with lack of direction and deal with being stuck. And one of the places that we point people often, and especially for people beginning to find their way in these traditions, is to go and sort out their stuff with their Egun, right? Go sort out their stuff with their ancestors, to start taking care of those spirits and start building a relationship with that. Because one of the things is, if we don't have a good foundation with those ancestors, they can block everything else that we're doing. Even the Orishas, there can be times where the Egun won't allow anything to happen because they need something, or they want something, or they don't want something. And so, this is a card where we sort of run into that energy that can lead to opening the roads, but often isn't where people want to go or want to start with, because, lots of people have issues with their ancestors, right?
Right.
Ancestors, so yeah.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting. So the sort of central element in the card is a tree, and the tree made me think of the family tree, the connections with those who came before and those who will come after you. Before the tree is the offering, and so to me, now that you explain it, I can see the relationship with what I know of as the Eight of Cups. The idea that in your darkest moments, where do you turn?
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah, and what drives you from that moment? What brought you to that moment, and what brings you out of it? And I think that card, even though we normally see it as a person turning away and walking away from something or walking towards something, it's ambiguous. I think that there's a real sense of passing between realms.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that makes a lot of sense as far as this the symbolic representations that you have in the card go. Yeah. Okay. So swords. Oh, I think that I was talking with a friend about your Three of Swords because I thought it was such a powerful story. And of course, the Three of Swords is a card that I think it's really important for people to get to know and face better, because for example, in Rider-Waite-Smith, you have those three swords piercing a heart, and it's such a, viscerally striking image that sometimes people almost don't want to engage with it in any kind of detail. So I think it's really helpful that there's not just a sorrowful story attached to it in your deck, but one that, has complexity, that has nuance, that has sort of human psychology that you can dig into. So the card itself is, rather than showing three swords, we have instead the figure in the front, who is Ochosi, and then Ochosi the hunter, and then you see the figure in the background. And would you tell a little bit of that story?
Sure. So Ochosi is a hunter, and Ochosi is known for being just. And Ochosi is like the letter of the law, no exceptions, no mercy kind of justice, right? So if people, need justice and they go to Ochosi, you 100% better be in the right, because Ochosi will, let the blame fall where it needs to fall. And if that's partly on you, be aware of that before you approach him, right?
Right. And there are several concepts of justice within the tradition as well, which I think you mentioned on your justice card, right?
For sure, right? So, one day, Olafin, one of the aspects of the creator, asked Ochosi to go and catch this bird. And being a masterful hunter, Ochosi went and did that, and brought it home and left it in a little cage before he was going to take it down. And his mother, Yamaya, came out and seen the bird, assumed it was for dinner, and killed it, plucked it, and started cooking it. And then when Ochosi came home, he saw that the bird was gone, and he was angry because it had been so hard to get his hands on, right? It was rare and hard to find in the forest. And so he, obviously wanted to please the creator, so he went out and pursued another one and caught it and brought it. And Llewellyn was so pleased that he said he would grant him whatever wish he had. And Ochosi said that he wanted to have his arrow be cursed such that whoever had stolen this bird would be struck down by it wherever they were. So Llewellyn agreed, and Ochosi fired his arrow, over the forest, and of course it struck down and killed his mother. And of course, the Orishas are Orishas and not people, so she later gets brought back to life and so on. But it's that lesson on our nature and the way in which our nature and our insistence on certain things can cause us tremendous unforeseen suffering. And I think that Three of Swords is a card where, not that inflexibility is the only cause of suffering, but it's certainly a common cause of suffering, because the actual point that the issue of that caused the suffering is usually over at the point where I see the Three of Swords, right?
Right.
Usually done, and it's how we feel about it and what we do about it. Do we double down on it? Do we commit to it? Do we wallow in it? Do we live afraid forever? It's all of those kinds of questions and energies.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree. I think that with the Three of Swords, there's always this feeling that it's the thing that you realize that you now cannot unrealize. It's the thing you see you can't unsee. And how you deal with that is really important, because you try to deny it, you're in for a world of consequences.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
It's a card we're being somewhat Buddhist about it, Well, attachment isn't helping me here. How do I become unattached to this outcome?
Right. And I think it's really important, too, that the moment in the story that you chose to represent, because we're looking at Ochosi with his back to us. It's not before he's done it. It's not the moment where he's, possessed by wrath and deciding that his arrow must be cursed. It's the moment where he realizes what he's done.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And he sees the figure of his mother through the trees there. Yeah, it's incredibly powerful, and I think, really, really resonant. You don't need to see 3 arrows to understand the pain of this story. Yeah. Okay, and I guess one other minor I'd like to talk about is the Two of Discs. It's interesting. I actually went to the Two of Discs as one of the first cards, because I wondered if you'd sign it, because I know that that's a Marseille tradition, but your signature is in fact on the Ace of Wands. Yeah, which I guess has to do with your connection with Shango. Yeah. But the Two of Discs is interesting to me because, in Rider-Waite-Smith, you see the person juggling the 2 pentacles, and which has always struck me as a fairly static representation of the idea of change that goes with this card. So what's the nature of the change that you were representing in your Two of Discs?
So in the story of the Two of Discs, there was this person named Mewa who was responsible for this town. And Mewa was a powerful magician, and they kept all the negative things in the world locked away through the power of their magic. Death, sickness, all of these things, they kept them locked in boxes and cauldrons and things in the back of their house, right? And because they spent so much time around these energies, and because they were kind of mysterious, people didn't really like Mewa that much. And they kind of feared him and were suspicious of him. And one day this new person came to town named Eogbe, and Eogbe was young and vibrant and full of life and fun and the life of the party and all of these kinds of things. And so over time, the people decided that they wanted Eogbe as their leader instead of Mewa. And instead of dealing with it in a direct manner, they decided to cheat Mewa out of their their rulership.
Mm-hmm.
And so they got Eogbe to challenge Mewa to cut down these trees with machetes. And when they gave the machetes out, they had blunted the one for Mewa. And so, of course, Eogbe wins in no time. And Mewa immediately realizes what has been done, right? As soon as he's machete's like, oh, you people have done this now. I see what's going on. And so Mewa says, okay, if you really want Eogbe to be your leader, no problem. Here you are. And I'm also going to release everything that I've been holding for all of you. You can have it.
Right.
And so death and sickness and loss and gossip and all of the negativities were released that day. And then as their final curse on the world, Mewa said, and on top of all these things, I'm also going to curse you with money. So you can fight about what everything is worth. And so he unleashed that as well and then left. And so the card shows the trees with the machetes and the sort of smoke of this sort of unleashing of, all of these energies into the world, into people's lives.
Yeah. I think that's a wild story. And I think, often when we see the Two of Discs, we receive it as a pretty, it's often visually represented as a pretty positive card. But I think as people, we often are very fearful of change. Change itself is not something that most of us advocate for, really. We don't really want to live in interesting times. And I also think that the idea that this story contains about the invention of money seems so appropriate for the Two of Discs.
I think of the Two of Discs as being, I often associate it with being like a ship riding the waves on the sea, right?
Right.
It's
right.
dynamic and there's movement, and it might be calm one day and wavy another. And the question is not only how do we deal with what's immediately in front of us, but how do we navigate and continue to navigate the ups and downs of life as we move forward, right?
Right.
That juggling thing, although it's, the juggler is perhaps static, the juggling is incredibly dynamic. And if we're being tossed up and down in the air, how do we roll with that and manage our capacity to roll with that so that we can get ahead in life and weather those storms, and overcome those things.
Right. And, from a kind of hermetic point of view, the Two of Discs is associated with Jupiter ruling the first decade of Capricorn, Jupiter, of course, being represented in Golden Dawn related decks as the Wheel of Fortune. And this is about writing fortune up, down, wherever it takes you.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
If you're lucky, or if you're wise, you get some of that potential Capricorn consistent, solid work.
Well, exactly. It's Saturn versus Jupiter, right? It's the engines that the compression and expansion that drive the engines of change. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess before we go on to talking about the spread you included, which I'm really interested in, I wanted to know how your relationship with Shango may or may not have influenced his representation in your deck. Did you communicate? Did you ask? Did you, in what way did your own personal relationship with the Orisha guide your artistic decisions?
Well, if you ask any child of Shango, they'll tell you it's great to be a child of Shango. Okay? So we'll start with that. Good being a child of Shango. Shango is great. But Shango is also generally pretty easygoing. Shango's and Orisha is like the life of the party, and really, if you give him some food and maybe a glass of wine, he's probably pretty happy, right? The Orisha that was the most challenging and that I felt the most interaction with when making this deck was Oshun. And I must have drawn a dozen different cards with Oshun in it. And no, that's not what I look like. That's like, it wasn't that verbal, but I could just feel the sense of like, no. And I'd look and I'd be like, all right, delete, try again.
So just to sort of go over this for people who aren't familiar with the Orisha, so is it correct to sorry, that Oshun is an Orisha of love, that she's one of the primary Orisha. She's associated with, I think, the color yellow, that she, that people go to her for as something of a Venus figure, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely sort of popular culture true.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Oshun is ultimately a mystery, and nobody knows Oshun but Oshun, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, they say that she cries when she's happy, she laughs when she's angry, right?
Ah, I see. Yeah.
And that we can never really know or understand what is going on with Oshun, because she is fundamentally a mystery.
And she is associated with rivers, is that right?
Yeah, she's often associated with the river.
Mm-hmm. Sweet waters.
Yeah, but it depends on who she is, which path, right?
Yeah.
My path of Oshun, Ibukole, is associated with the vulture, right?
Right.
And other things. There are many different permutations. You know, my elder Willie Ramos has a great book on the paths of Oshun, which you can get online and places like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks all about the different paths of Oshuns and what they're like and so on. And it's tremendously eye-opening, because, you know, love is one piece of it, but it's definitely not her primary attribute. You know,
gotcha.
And,
yeah.
You know, between her and Shango, they both represent different aspects of the joy of being alive.
Yeah.
But Oshun also, you know, can also be that bitterness of life as well, right?
Yeah, I think I was fascinated by your choice to show her, and I think the Judgment card, where you see the peacock transforming into the vulture as it's burnt by the rays of the sun. Yeah. So you were saying that she was the one who you struggled with the most to depict? Yeah,
she was going to be in a number of other places, and I felt like she didn't want to, or she didn't like the art that I made or whatever, and so so she's there. She's where she is, but she's not nearly as many cards as I thought she might originally be. She wasn't happy with some of the stories I was telling or how I told them, and there were a couple of stories that are maybe not as favorable to Oshun, and the feeling I had was, just don't tell those stories. I was like, people get involved in the tradition, they'll find them if they need to.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So you include a spread at the back, a 4-card spread. Can you tell us about the creation of that spread?
Yeah, I mean, I love making up spreads, right? I do a lot of creative spreads. And, you know, I really wanted to sort of try and create a spread that gave people an understanding of some of the, I don't know, almost like philosophical considerations of the dynamics of living a life in relationship to advice from the Orishas, right? You know, or living a life based on some of these philosophies and so on, right? So the 4 cards are, you know, there's Ire, right? There's the blessings, right? So what good is going to come from going down this road, whatever question you're asking. Osogbo, negativity. What are the obstacles that are going on here, right? Ashe, which is, you know, it's the energy of the universe, and it really kind of talks about, in this context, what are the things that you've got going for you? What's on your side, right? What's actually going to like show up and help you here? And then the 4th one is free will, right? Because, you know, we can get all the good advice and have all the spirits behind us we want and still not do anything, right?
Exactly.
You know, and then the idea is, once you've put all these down, if you then you know, total them up and do a little math and reduce it down to a trump card and put that in the middle as sort of the outcome of what comes.
Okay. So you did some numerology you're including in there.
Right? You know, and so you just add those up, and then that gives you an idea of what the outcome is, right?
Yeah.
The idea is that, you know, all of these cards have a story with each other, right? You know, what does the middle card look like with the negativity? What does it look like with the positivity? What does it add to the conversation about free will, right? And
exactly. So you have, in 1st and 2nd positions, you have the blessings and the difficulties, and 3rd and 4th, you essentially have something representing fate and something representing free will.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the
That's
other thing that's here that I think people will be interesting to sort of see how people do with it is, if in the blessings cards you get something that has nothing to do with what you actually want from the situation,
yes.
really stop, right?
Yeah.
Just don't
Yeah.
continue, right? And,
Right. Right.
there's this notion.
Or if you get Rubeus in geomancy as your first thing.
Yeah, forget it. You're done. Don't bother. Not today, right?
Yeah.
I think it's important to have these clear markers that just say to you, hey, this is not going where you want it to go.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's hard, right? Because it's hard to feel like we're giving up free will and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And have you been reading with the deck since you got your copy? Have you been doing your own sort of drawings for yourself with it?
I have been doing, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's been interesting. It's really interesting it's a completely different experience to read with a deck that you know completely, right?
Yes, I should think so. Yeah. Yeah. So what surprised you about that?
I mean, I fancy myself a little bit of a storyteller, and it really facilitates that process, right? For me.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like storytelling that I can easily slide into with this, and a lot of storying that isn't just sort of abstracted stories from other people or stories from my personal life, but sort of, there's a body of material that I have to speak from that I don't necessarily bring into my into my other reading practices, but shows up here, right? So.
Yeah, but what I'm really interested in is how, when you bring it to the context of the reading, whatever it is, the day ahead or the question you're reading for, what happens? Do you find yourself instantly kind of going to the body of knowledge that you brought to the card, or is it easy for you to apply in a more practical way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with. One of the reasons why I read with Marseille decks a lot is I'm with that whole sort of
open reading
body of people, like Yoav, Bendov, and Enrique, and and Amelia and others, where it's like I read what I see, right?
Yeah.
So when I look at the cards, I mean, I don't get out my book and read it.
Right.
I just look at what I see and I read those things, and then I allow that to trigger whatever needs to emerge from that process. I mean, generally speaking, I don't know that we have time to get into today, but I can say that I'll make a separate thing about it sometime for the podcast. But my personal reading process is usually a really elaborate multi-deck process these days.
Oh, wow.
that I do 2 or 3 times a week, and I sit down and spend about an hour going through and looking at the cards and journaling and making art and this whole process. It takes a long time for me, because I'm allowing the cards to really just dictate that and show me where it's going. So
right,
I'll share that somewhere else when
yeah. I mean, I was going to say, since you mentioned this elaborate reading, and we're actually almost out of time, I was wondering if you'd like to do either I do or you do a 1 card reading to sort of finish things off.
Sure. Do you want to do a reading?
Do you want me to read, or do you want to read yourself?
I want you to do a reading.
You want me to read? Okay. Yeah. All right. So, okay. Do you have something that you would like to ask?
I mean, I guess let's ask about the deck. How the launch of the deck is going to go.
Okay. All right.
Let's ask it.
Okay. So I'm shuffling now because I had things really sorted out into theirs. It was all ordered in sequence. So I know I have to shuffle a bunch of times to get that sorted out. Okay. And by the way, I love the backs too. They're really striking red, black, and white backs. And the only problem is that I now know from the red, from the wear patterns, whether it's going to come out reversed or upright.
There you go. Well, that's what you get for paying too much attention. So.
Curse of the Virgo, I'm telling you. Okay. All right. So I'm just laying them out now. And then, so the question was, how is the launch of the deck going to go? Or maybe we should say what you need to know about it.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Okay, this is the card that wants to come out. So, Andrew, I got the 5 of Cups.
5 of Cups.
So this is the story I think that you mentioned about. This is a story of a love triangle, as I understand it, and the idea that the Orisha you depicted in this card, whose name I can't recall off the top of my head, was trying to look for ways to make her lover more attracted to her, and was giving some poor advice. So I guess, when we look at 5 of Cups, it's tempting to get pretty negative about it, and I think that's not necessarily something you have to do. But I think that perhaps one thing we might say in terms of like the launching of your deck, that that a couple of things. Number one, you're going to have to let go, in some sense, the reception of the deck, right? Because it's no longer yours in some sense once it's out there.
Also known as don't read the comments.
Exactly. It belongs to the world now as well as you.
Yeah.
Right. And that can be, cause for mourning in its own way, because you no longer control the reception or the interpretation. And it may in some ways feel like a loss.
For sure.
But I think the truth of any 5 of Cups is that loss is, although it may cause pain to you, it's also a gift to someone else. It transforms. When you give up, the sacrifice you make transforms into something else, and that it's important to let that do its work in the world.
For sure.
Yeah. You're like, Susie, why didn't you pick the star?
Pick something better. Pick something. Well, we release it into the world and we see what happens.
Yeah.
We release it into the world and recognize the limits, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that, the 5 of Cups, that one of the downfalls is, what Crowley would have called the lust of results, right?
Exactly.
Overreaching and grabbing after things. It's like, I can't
That's
do anything.
right. Does not matter, need not be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've published a bunch of times myself, and it never goes out. It never turns out exactly the way you anticipate or hope.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing where it all ends up. So.
Well, I think, I have to say this has been a really fantastic deck to work with in the week that I've been working with it. The getting to know a little bit about the tradition has been an honor and a delight. And I really thank you for putting this out there in the world.
Well, and thank you for making time to both spend time with the deck in advance of doing this interview and for doing the interview today. And, people should definitely check out Susie and Mel's podcast, Fortune Wheelhouse, and also Susie's new book coming out this fall. So definitely.
Yep. You can find anything to do with what I do at my brand new, spanking new, freshly painted website, www.tsusancheng.com. Yeah, and the book Tarot Correspondences is coming out in October, just around the corner.
Perfect. And the Orisha deck is for sale through Llewellyn, probably through your local store, definitely through Amazon, and I've got them currently pre-sale, but they're arriving this week, so they should start shipping this week.
Pre-orders are going out, aren't they?
I'm just waiting for the final shipment to arrive next week. So
fantastic.
Right. Thanks, Susie.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it.
So, my friends, I hope that you enjoyed that episode. I hope that if you have grabbed a copy of the deck, you are enjoying it. It is 100% out as of the time of this posting. I've got them at the shop. You can order them from me. You can also get them from Amazon and, as we said, wherever good books are sold. If you are sharing stuff about it on social media, please feel free to tag me. I would love to see what you're up to with it. and to hear your thoughts. I am at the Hermit's Lamp pretty much everywhere. All right. We'll be back soon with another episode. Thank you, as always, for listening.